Hello everyone, I'm Julie Hartman. Today we're going to be talking about how Apple has restricted airdrop for protesters in China, Sam Bankman Fried does an apology tour for his cryptocurrency collapse, and the ever-growing phenomenon of helicopter parenting. This is Timeless. Hello and welcome again, everyone. Today is Friday, December 2nd, 2022. And before we dive into some new news stories, I have to give you some quick updates on some of the things that we've been talking about over the past 2 days. With regard to the railroad strike, it's not happening. Last night, the Senate voted in an 80-15 vote to force the remaining 4 unions who had rejected the railway contract to accept it. Again, as I said, averting a nationwide railway strike. The bill will be signed by President Biden today, and what's great about this is that it will avert us from having 30% of our goods be not transported by the railways. Now, having Congress force this contract on unions, whether you agree with it or not, does have the effect of diminishing the value of being in a union, because part of being in a union is, of course, the right to strike. And so you should know that some of the senators who forced these 4 unions to accept the contract claim to be pro-union. These are Cory Booker of New Jersey, Dianne Feinstein of California, Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Chuck Schumer of New York, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, and Sherrod Brown of Ohio. These Democrats all voted to force the contract on these unions. Again, just something that we should all be aware of. Another quick update on a story that I talked about is that 2 days ago on my first show, I reported on the new phenomenon of marijuana-induced psychosis that is due to the ever-growing THC concentrations in marijuana products. And an update on this story is that yesterday, 10 students at Van Nuys Middle School here in Los Angeles, which is just about 15 minutes away from where we are filming right now, 7 of those 10 students were hospitalized for what authorities call a cannabis overdose. So 10 students between 12 and 15 years old were displaying signs of, quote, mild to moderate distress. And though the health officials called this a cannabis overdose, the fact that the principal symptom that they cited was mild to moderate distress indicates that it was likely psychosis. Because again, you can't really overdose on cannabis or THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana. So unfortunately, I anticipate that we'll be seeing a lot more stories, both at middle schools and high schools, of people experiencing psychosis due to marijuana. So just wanted to update you on that. Now to the biggest story of the day. Apple is restricting the airdrop function in China to help the Chinese government interfere with the anti-COVID lockdown and anti-Chinese Communist Party protests that have been going on in the past week or two. And Chinese citizens have been using airdrop to get their message out. They've been using it to distribute anti-Xi Jinping leaflets to one another and to send each other information about protest times, locations, and other logistics. And now Apple, because it has factories in China and does a lot of business with China, is facilitating the CCP's ability to undermine and suppress these protests. But what's crazy to me is that the tech company that American liberals are furious at and want to boycott is not Apple, it's Twitter. They seem to yawn when Apple is trying to prevent foreigners from speaking about their human rights abuses, but yet they are furious at Elon Musk for trying to provide an open forum where everyone is allowed to speak. To me, this represents what is fundamentally wrong with American progressivism. For all that we in this country obsess about racism, and people my age say all the time that it's our crusade in life to fight against racism, this right here is Racism 101. It is deeply racist to think that it's okay for an American company like Apple to allow a government in another part of the world to abuse their citizens because that's just what happens in those countries, when historically we would not allow Apple to do something like that here in the United States. Can you imagine if Apple prevented people from airdropping protest information during the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020? Arthur Schlesinger, who was an advisor to JFK, had this great quote in the 1960s. He said, if you want to really see evidence of racism in the United States, it's that white Americans think that communism is an acceptable form of government for non-white people. And it really is true that we seem to have different standards for people who don't look like us or people in other countries. One of the greatest examples of this in the past few years is that the state of Georgia passed a pro-life law. I believe it was in 2020 or maybe 2019. And Hollywood production companies, after that law was passed, started to announce that they would not do business in the state of Georgia. They would not film there. But instead, they decided to move their operations to China, which, as we all know, has an egregious massacre of the Uyghur population and commits human rights abuses daily against its citizens. Another example of this is that a few weeks ago there was a story that a Palestinian in the West Bank was beheaded because he was gay. He was beheaded by the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or a group that is very anti-homosexual. And his head was put on a post and paraded around the West Bank, and people were cheering because this gay guy was guillotined, essentially. And I sent this article around to a few of my peers just to see what their reaction was. And it was fascinating to me because so many of them responded things like, oh my gosh, so sad, or scary, or oh, awful. And I thought, why is that your reaction? Can't we have a more vigorous reaction? Why aren't you saying this is savage? This is tragic. We don't use that word anymore. This is evil. Again, can you imagine if this happened in the United States, if a gay person in the United States was beheaded and his head was put on a post, and paraded around the United States? Do you think that people would be reacting, oh, so sad? It's racist logic. It's sort of a racist worldview that those people in those parts of the world don't matter because that's just what happens in their neck of the woods. The sad reality, though, is that maybe there's a group of American liberals who would be okay with Apple suppressing airdrop in the United States as long as they selectively did so to target conservatives. And we've seen this just over the past 2 years with regard to COVID, that conservative social media accounts who questioned lockdowns or vaccines were selectively suppressed for spreading quote unquote misinformation. But the accounts that supported lockdowns and vaccines remained untouched and untampered with. This double standard used to apply only to other countries, but now I fear that their double standard is migrating home. Now we're going to turn our attention to Sam Bankman Fried, who is the 30-year-old MIT graduate who has been in the news recently, I'm sure you're all aware, for the collapse of his cryptocurrency exchange, FTX. Mr. Bankman Fried has said that in just a week, his net worth has gone from about $20 billion to a mere 100,000. Now, of course, 100,000 isn't mere for most people, but for him, can you imagine in 1 week going from being on the Fortune 500 list to going down to 6 digits? That must have been a pretty big slap in the face. But I want to give you a background, a really simple and understandable background of this cryptocurrency scandal, because I find it to be confusing. And also, I want to spend some time analyzing this SBF character. By the way, I'm going to refer to him as SBF because that is what he said that he likes to be called. The more that I learn about SBF, the more that I feel like I already know him, or at least others like him who have replaced the hard work of building a solid life and career and a sound character with the substitutes that today's vacant culture celebrates: branding, networking, resume building, having an impact, and this busy self-importance of an overfilled schedule and connections bespeaking that you feel life more than others do. Now, a few years ago, SBF left his quant job, number crunching at one of these big financial firms, and he decided to go out on a limb and enter into the world of crypto. Now, cryptocurrencies are forms of digital money that are created and exist only on computers, where they are mined by solving arbitrary mathematical problems that only a computer savant would attempt. And so cryptocurrencies are one part of what's called the blockchain, which is a supposedly more efficient, transparent, and accurate system of keeping track of who owns what and where it is. And if this sounds like it doesn't make sense, I agree with you. Cryptocurrencies are essentially currencies for computer coders who solve a bunch of tricky digital problems and somehow log on to a magical trove of fake money. But back in 2017, SBF took a $10,000 amount of Bitcoin, which is the best known type of cryptocurrency, and used arbitrage, which is taking advantage of small bid and offer differences across different cryptocurrency exchanges to buy and sell huge volumes of Bitcoin quickly, which, if done right, can generate big profits. And so he used arbitrage to grow his $10,000 investment into $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, at least on paper. But this wasn't enough for a young SBF. He wanted more money, more recognition, and more fame. So 2 years later, in 2019, to attract the really big money, SBF set up FTX, which is the firm that just went bankrupt. And FTX was not a trading firm, but rather an exchange for people to essentially give dollar amounts, and then FTX would help them turn those dollar amounts into cryptocurrencies. So they attracted big venture capitalist people like Larry David, Tom Brady, Gisele Bündchen, Steph Curry, Shaquille O'Neal, and Naomi Osaka. People who, again, wanted to avoid the wonky math problems of cryptocurrency mining and use their own dollars to buy and sell Bitcoin on a ceaseless upward trajectory to digital financial nirvana. And so with this new company, FTX, SBF, again, that's Sam Bankman-Fried, I'm referring to him as SBF because that's what he wants to be called. SBF had this big venture capital money that he coveted. But he had his own company called Alameda Research, where he traded cryptocurrency for his own account. So he had Alameda Research, which was for him, and then there was FTX, which was for these celebrities or regular people, for them to give their own dollars again and make it into crypto. And so between these two companies, SBF became worth $22.5 billion. He was number 32 on the Forbes 400 list in October 2021, and he was the youngest person other than Mark Zuckerberg ever to become so wealthy. And so with these two companies, SBF soon became arrogant, and he started to do some really shady business. So FTX, which was, again, the exchange firm, began lending Alameda Research, which was SBF's own trading firm, huge sums of money, a lot of it apparently belonging to customers. So here's where some gray-haired adult supervision of SBF might have averted the present catastrophe. Owning a controlling interest in two companies that are related in business and deal with one another commercially obviously is fraught with risks of conflict of interest or other failures to observe proper corporate hygiene. So SBF used this opportunity to bend and break the rules. He selected his then girlfriend, Caroline Ellison, to run Alameda Research while he ran FTX, and while FTX was borrowing heavily from Alameda Research. The two companies shared an office space and had access to each other's sensitive information, which helped to facilitate the self-dealing. And maybe the most shocking is that neither company had any outsiders, that is, a non-owner, non-officer, or non-employees on its board of directors. And the board of directors is the most powerful and important in-house watchdog for a company. So, like the story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and perished when the heat melted the wax attaching his wings to his arms, SBF committed a fatal error. Perhaps intoxicated by his success and feeling invulnerable, he decided to go in front of Congress and testify, urging them to regulate cryptocurrency markets. And this was just, frankly, the most stupid decision that SBF could have made. It's like a guy in school who cheats constantly on a test, going up to the teacher and going, "Hey, Mrs. Frank, there's a lot of cheating going on in this class. I just want to make you aware." When that student that was going to the teacher was the principal one cheating. So a CEO of a rival cryptocurrency exchange firm took offense to SBF's testimony in front of Congress. And they said, you know what? We're done with the Sam Bankman-Fried guy. They announced that they're going to sell all of their digital tokens that they had issued in FTX. And so a lot of other investors decided to do this too. And they pulled their money out of FTX and demanded that Sam Bankman-Fried redeem their accounts in dollar money instead of crypto money. And this is what caused FTX to be exposed. That FTX could not give those investors back their money because he had given that money to his own firm, Alameda Research. And on November 14th, just about 2 weeks ago, 3 days after the collapse of FTX on November 11th, the New York Times published an account of SBF's demise that was widely condemned as too lenient and too forgiving of his offenses. It was panned on Twitter as a puff piece and a breathless love letter. And SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, was still, even though his fraud was exposed on November 11th, he was still a featured speaker at a New York Times hosted event that took place just 2 days ago or 3 days ago on November 30th. This event was called the Deal Book Summit, and SBF was joined by other celebrity demi-deities like Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Fink, the CEOs of TikTok and Amazon, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And they all got up on a panel to tell the rest of us what to think, or more accurately, what to claim that we think if we wish to remain and rise in the new world that they have decided that we must live in. So at this New York Times conference, SBF got up in front of everyone. Well, actually, I think he was on a screen, but nevertheless, he said to the crowd, "I've had a bad week," and he kind of dodged the huge fraud scandal that is now becoming as clear as day. SBF is facing, some are estimating, decades of jail time. But he did sit down for an interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC. Let's look at what he said.
Did you know that FTX deposits were used to pay off Alameda creditors?
I don't know of FTX deposits being used to pay off Alameda creditors on there.
So he kind of denies it originally or sideswipes it. And then later in the interview, George Stephanopoulos, to his credit, presses SBF, and he kind of comes around a little bit to admitting his wrongdoings. Let's see what he says again. Are we playing a clip?
So you do know, and you did know, that FTX deposits were being funneled to Alameda?
So I was vaguely aware that that was how some wires were being sent in the first place.
Didn't that set off alarm bells in your head?
So there were a lot of people who were involved in that process. And look, I really deeply wish that I had taken like a lot more responsibility for understanding what the details were of what was going on there.
Of course, though, Sam Bankman-Fried really isn't the story here. This, to me, is a story of our society. I remember at my Harvard graduation a few months ago, I was really taken aback by the amount of times that the speakers told us in the audience, "You young people, you graduates, you're going to go change the world." And I just thought that that was a little bit too much puffery of people my age. You know, yes, it's an accomplishment to graduate from college, but what have we really done to deserve this kind of crown placed on our heads that we are going to go out and change things? But it's indicative of the fact that our society lionizes young, up-and-coming innovators and, again, change makers. People like Sam Bankman-Fried who are doing what's seen as new and cool things like engaging in the cryptocurrency market. Now, we all know about Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, who ran this company that supposedly had a product that could take a small amount of blood and run a bunch of tests to see if you had any ailments. We all know that her technology ended up being a fraud. And nevertheless, she ran her fraud for 12 years. She got investors like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and all of these big titans of industry up in Silicon Valley. And like SBF, she was on the cover of financial magazines and was on the Fortune 500 list, and she was called one of these young people who was going to change the world. And as we know, it turned out that like Sam Bankman-Fried, she was a fraud. But both Sam Bankman-Fried and Elizabeth Holmes' principal qualifications were their self-promotion and self-interest, which they camouflaged by having a fluent command of pseudo-earnest foundation boardroom speak and these fake altruistic vapidities like, "I want to make an impact." And all of it, both for SBF and Elizabeth Holmes, all of it was intended to disarm and seduce customers, investors, regulators, and journalists. And again, both of them succeeded for far too long because they were simply a brand too appealing for the American elite to check out the actual product. Now, the final segment that I want to turn to today has to do with helicopter parenting. And I thought that it was an especially apt topic to discuss in the wake of reporting on Sam Bankman-Fried, because in addition to the fact that people my age are told that we're going to be these successful change makers, I think a lot of the reason why we see people like Elizabeth Holmes or Sam Bankman-Fried is because of this helicopter parenting that we have nowadays, where parents are obsessed with the accomplishments of their children. And what also motivated me to talk about this is the World Cup that is going on now. And those of you who have listened to Dennis and Julie may know that I grew up playing soccer. I was also a swimmer and a water polo player at an extremely competitive level. And not to brag, but my soccer team when I was 12 was the third best team in California. And watching the World Cup has caused me to think about my sports years when I was super young. And although in the single-digit age range, I really enjoyed those sports, with every succeeding year as I got older, they became less and less enjoyable and eventually turned miserable. The main reason for this is that my sports were no longer about recreation and became only about one thing: winning. Even though many of the players, myself included, were competitive and ambitious ourselves, because we were in our adolescent or teenage years, this win above all attitude was overwhelmingly directed by coaches and by parents. And I just noticed over time that the prevailing attitude became about, we have to win this tournament, we have to advance to this next conference, or we have to get all these players recruited to college, instead of having the attitude of, why don't we help the team players grow? Or why don't we build character? Or use these games as opportunities to bond with fellow teammates. In addition to the shifts in attitude that I saw as I got older and older, I also experienced firsthand that the time devoted to these sports was just excessive. We would have morning practices, afternoon practices, sometimes weekend practices for at least 2 hours each. Tournaments happened almost every weekend. If we didn't have practices, we would have tournaments. And my parents would drive me to play games in God knows where, California. So I grew up just traveling all the time. My practices became extremely rigid. Every minute was structured. My coaches really didn't allow for fun time. Like I remember when I was super young, they used to let us, for the last 10 minutes of swimming practice, play a Sharks and Minnows game. And that was like the most fun part of the week. But once you got to like 7 or 8 years old, you were told Sharks and Minnows is just for the 5-year-olds. You've got to, practice for every single minute of those 2 hours. And if you were chatting with a friend during practice, I remember my coaches would make me swim a bunch of laps of butterfly, or in the case of my playing soccer, I'd have to run around the field 10 times. So again, it was very structured and rigid and all towards this win, accomplish attitude. And most of all, I noticed that coaches and parents really behaved inappropriately and would often humiliate you in the name of improved performance. I just have a litany of vivid memories of being on the soccer field or in the pool, and I would make a bad pass. And trust me, when you make a bad pass, you are already humiliated when you make that bad pass. You know that you made a bad pass. Everyone knows that you made a bad pass. But then the coach would scream at you, not just in front of your teammates, not just in front of the opposing team, but in front of your parents and your teammates' parents. the opposing team's parents, excuse me. And as I mentioned, it wasn't just the coaches who were overbearing. Parents too would scream at their children. A lot of parents on my team would meticulously watch games and oftentimes stay to watch the full practices. And not only would they scream at their kids, but they would scream at me and other kids on the team too. Now, before I continue, I want to cut in and say that I have mixed feelings about this time in my life. In many ways, especially as I'm older, I'm grateful that I had this experience because as miserable as I was at times, I think it made me into an incredibly strong person. And I feel like no matter what life throws at me, if something causes me shame or humiliation, if someone is mean to me, if I'm in a situation that is uncomfortable, I feel like thanks to those years of my life, I have the infrastructure to deal with it. And as corny as that sounds, that is an extremely empowering feeling. But nevertheless, I'm telling you about my sports experience because, of course, I want you to get to know me. But more importantly, because it fits into this phenomenon of helicopter parenting, that has become so in vogue nowadays. These are parents who place an extreme long-term focus on the career and social life of their child. From basically the time of birth, almost every unit of time is scheduled and activities are goal and accomplishment oriented. These are parents who tend to have a competitive and comparative focus. They relentlessly compare and judge their child against others and have an immense fear of failure and shame or lack of accomplishment. And I also want to make clear, because I know my parents are watching, that I really am lucky to have a great relationship with my parents who did not put the kind of pressure on me that other parents did. And I have to give my parents credit that they often stood up for me when the coaches or other parents were screaming or were too overbearing. But still, this overbearing parenting style is really common nowadays, especially in affluent and coastal parts of the country. But interestingly, though, the phenomenon of helicopter parenting did not exist 40 years ago. The word parent started to be used as a verb only really in the 1970s. Helicopter parenting as a style only really came about strongly in the late 80s and gathered strength in the 1990s and 2000s, mainly as a consequence of economic anxiety over the thinning of the middle class into either rich or poor, and also because of heightened status consciousness that impelled parents to want their kids to have fancy educational and professional credentials. A 2018 article in the New York Times stated that the amount of time that mothers spend reading to children, doing crafts with them, taking them to sports or music lessons, attending games and recitals, or helping them with homework has increased from 1 hour and 45 minutes weekly in 1975 to over 5 hours weekly in 2018. A 2018 survey of over 30,000 American parents of small children found that across race, education, and income, that the most expensive and intrusive parenting styles were seen as the best. And also, the American Academy of Pediatrics said that parents' leisure time today is much more likely to be spent with their children than in past generations. So, before the late 20th century, the norm in America for parents was what's called free-range parenting. This is allowing your children to make decisions about their diet, bedtime, schoolwork, after-school activities, and friendships. This is a parenting style where they don't recognize achievements, awards, and honors as being the principal source of fulfillment as a parent, and they don't want achievements to be the overriding factor in how their child's time and effort is organized. These are parents who let their kids figure things out for themselves, and even if they make bad or wrong decisions, they let their kids, for better or for worse, learn how to take the consequences. Because helicopter parenting is a relatively new phenomenon in American history, we don't yet know the full effects of it on the helicopter children, since many are barely full-fledged adults. But it made me wonder, does helicopter parenting as a style correlate with anything else? A study published this year in the Carnegie Mellon Journal of Experimental Psychology sought to see whether the choice of one or the other parenting style correlated with the role or style that a person thought that the government ought to take. And it was seeking to examine a decades-old theory of George Philip Lakoff, who is a professor who created this hypothesis called government as family. This was the idea this was the idea that someone's view of the way a family should function strongly tracks with their view of the way a government should function. And Professor Lakoff thought that conservatives were more heavy-handed or paternalistic, and that liberals were more supportive of and nurturing, both in their parenting styles and in the approach of how they favored government. And so the results of this Carnegie Mellon study indicated that helicoptering or free range in parenting style is in fact mirrored in whether someone favors a coercive or a hands-off approach by government. So parenting style was a strong predictor of whether a person preferred an intrusive or heavy-handed or hands-off role. But it was not specific to a political party or an ideology. In other words, a helicopter parent who was a Democrat might have favored mask and vaccine mandates, and a helicopter parent who was a Republican might have favored a different political position, but a similarly intrusive approach. For instance, they would have favored a law explicitly prohibiting cities from requiring masks or vaccines. But on the other hand, a free-range parent who was a Democrat might have wanted people to wear masks and get vaccinated, but they were not in favor of mandating it. And similarly, a free-range Republican parent may have been against masks or vaccinations, but they thought that it should be up to individual choice. Again, as I said, we don't know quite yet the full effect that helicoptering has on a child. But as you can probably tell from the sports experience that I described a few minutes ago, I have some strong opinions about the harmful effects that I think it has on the decision-making abilities and happiness of the child. Now, some people have argued to me that maybe with the increasing presence of woke ideas that eliminate standards, that helicopter parenting might subside. When I was in high school, my school was excessively academically rigorous. And now, even though it's only been about 5 years since I graduated, it is super woke. And in some classes, they've allowed you to retake tests. They've allowed homework and participation in some classes to not count for a grade. Because, again, they've embraced this woke idea that judgment and evaluation is seen as racist. But I still don't think that the softening of standards will eliminate helicopter parenting. In fact, I think it might increase it by driving it underground. I don't think a parent is going to say, okay, now my kid's homework doesn't count for a grade, so I'm going to stop directing their lives. If anything, I think that parent will probably put more pressure on their child to be a good student, because they will want to establish a starker contrast between their child and other students who need relaxed standards. So again, helicopter parenting is increasing, and to circle it back to SBF, I think that it contributes to these phenomena of these uber achieving people who will go to great lengths, including fraud, to get a credential or to be on the cover of a magazine. And I just want to ask the question, is this really where our priorities as a society should be? Thank you again for joining us. It has been so fun launching this show this week, and we will see you next week. And remember, each of our thoughts, choices, and actions, big and small, shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Bye, everyone. See you soon.